Heavenly Stories.
The sun dipped low over the Sea of Galilee, casting a golden hue across the water that shimmered like molten glass. The air was thick with the scent of fish and damp earth, and the small fishing boat bobbed gently against the shore. Jesus, weary from a long day of teaching, climbed aboard with his disciples, his sandaled feet steady despite the boat's sway. The crowd that had followed him all day lingered on the shore, their voices a fading murmur as the disciples pushed off, oars slicing through the water. "Let's go across to the other side," Jesus said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that silenced the chatter among the men. The disciples, a mix of fishermen and others unaccustomed to the sea, settled into their roles. Peter, burly and confident, took charge of the rudder, while Andrew and John checked the sails. James, John's brother, grumbled about the late hour, his stomach growling audibly. Thomas, ever the skeptic, scanned the horizon, muttering about the wisdom of crossing the lake at dusk. The boat glided smoothly at first, the gentle lapping of waves against the hull a soothing rhythm. Jesus, seated near the stern, leaned back against a cushion, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The disciples exchanged glances. How could he rest so easily after such a day? As they ventured farther from shore, the sky began to change. The golden light dimmed, swallowed by a creeping veil of clouds that rolled in from the north. The air grew heavy, charged with an unsettling stillness. Peter, his fisherman's instincts kicking in, frowned at the darkening horizon. "Looks like a storm's brewing," he said, his voice low but tense. Andrew nodded, tightening his grip on the oar. The others, less experienced, shrugged it off, trusting the fisherman's skill to navigate whatever came their way. The first gust of wind hit without warning, a sharp blast that whipped across the deck and snapped the sail taut. The boat lurched, and Matthew, who had been scribbling notes about Jesus' parables, stumbled and grabbed the mast. The sea, once calm, began to churn, waves rising like restless beasts. The disciples' chatter turned to shouts as they scrambled to secure the sail. Jesus, however, remained still, his breathing steady, his face serene even as the wind howled around him. The storm grew fiercer, the sky now a roiling mass of black clouds. Lightning cracked, illuminating the terrified faces of the disciples. Waves crashed over the boat's sides, soaking their robes and filling the hull with water. Peter bellowed orders, his voice barely audible over the gale. "Bail it out. Keep the boat steady," he shouted, as John and James scooped water with frantic hands. The boat rocked violently, threatening to capsize. Fear gripped the men, their hearts pounding as they realized the storm was unlike any they had faced before. Judas, clutching a rope, yelled over the wind, "We're going to sink. This is madness." His words echoed the growing panic among the others. Even Peter, the seasoned fisherman, felt a cold dread settle in his chest. The Sea of Galilee was notorious for its sudden, violent storms, but this one seemed personal, as if the elements themselves were conspiring against them. They looked to Jesus, still asleep, his calm a stark contrast to their chaos. How could he sleep through this? Did he not care? The disciples' faith, so strong on the shore amidst the crowds, wavered in the face of the storm. They had seen Jesus heal the sick, cast out demons, and speak with authority that silenced Pharisees. But this was different. This was nature itself, wild and untamed, threatening to swallow them whole. As the boat tilted dangerously, water pooling at their feet, they began to wonder if they had misjudged the man they followed. Could he really be the Messiah if he slept while they faced death? The storm raged on, its fury unrelenting. The Sea of Galilee had transformed into a churning cauldron, waves towering over the small boat like giants ready to crush it. The disciples fought desperately to keep the vessel afloat, their hands raw from gripping ropes and oars. Water poured in faster than they could bail, and the sail, now torn, flapped uselessly in the wind. Lightning illuminated the chaos, casting jagged shadows across their faces, faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Peter, his voice hoarse from shouting, clung to the rudder, his muscles straining to keep the boat from spinning out of control. "We're not gonna make it," he roared, his words half swallowed by the wind. John, drenched and shivering, dumped another bucket of water overboard, only for a new wave to crash in. Thomas, his skepticism now replaced by raw terror, muttered prayers under his breath, his eyes darting to the dark water that seemed to hunger for them. Even the fishermen among them, who had faced storms before, felt their confidence crumble. This was no ordinary squall, it was as if the sea itself had turned against them. In the midst of the chaos, Jesus remained asleep, curled against the cushion in the stern. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of a man at peace, untouched by the howling wind or the rocking boat. The disciples stole glances at him, their frustration mounting. How could he sleep through this? Did he not see the danger? Matthew, clinging to the mast, shouted over the storm, "Does he even know we're dying out here?" His words carried a bitter edge, reflecting the doubt creeping into their hearts. Finally, it was Andrew who broke. Scrambling over the slippery deck, he dropped to his knees beside Jesus, shaking his shoulder. "Teacher," he cried, his voice cracking with desperation. "Don't you care that we're perishing?" The others joined in, their voices a chorus of fear and urgency. "Jesus, wake up. We're going to drown." Their shouts were raw, tinged with both anger and pleading. They had left everything to follow this man, and now, in their moment of greatest need, he seemed oblivious. Jesus stirred, his eyes opening slowly, as if roused from a dream rather than a deadly storm. He sat up, his movements deliberate, unhurried. The disciples watched, their breath catching, expecting him to leap into action, to grab an oar or help bail water. Instead, he looked out at the raging sea, his expression calm, almost curious. The wind tore at his robe, but he stood steady, his presence a stark contrast to the chaos around him. "Why are you so afraid?" he asked, his voice cutting through the storm with a clarity that silenced the disciples' shouts. His tone was gentle but carried a weight that made them pause. "Do you still have no faith?" The question hung in the air, piercing their hearts. They exchanged glances, shame mingling with their fear. Faith? How could they have faith when the boat was filling with water, when the waves threatened to swallow them whole? Before they could respond, Jesus stood, his feet planted firmly on the tilting deck. He raised his hands toward the sea, his eyes fixed on the churning waves. "Peace, be still," he commanded, his voice resonant, authoritative, as if speaking to a rebellious child. The disciples froze, their hands still clutching ropes and buckets, their eyes wide. The wind seemed to hesitate, the waves pausing in their assault, as if the elements themselves were listening. In that moment, the storm began to shift. The howling wind softened to a whisper, the towering waves flattened, and the black clouds parted to reveal a sliver of starlit sky. The boat, moments ago on the verge of sinking, settled into a gentle sway. The disciples stood stunned, their breath ragged, as the sea grew calm, mirroring the peace in Jesus' voice. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft drip of water from the oars. The sudden calm was almost as disorienting as the storm had been. The Sea of Galilee lay still, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the faint stars that now peeked through the dissipating clouds. The boat, no longer battered by waves, rocked gently, the only sound the creak of wood and the heavy breathing of the disciples. They stood frozen, their hands still gripping ropes or buckets, their eyes darting between the sea and the man who had silenced it. Jesus lowered his hands, his gaze sweeping over the disciples. His expression was unreadable, part compassion, part challenge. The weight of his earlier question, "Do you still have no faith?" lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. Peter, still at the rudder, let out a shaky breath, his knuckles white from gripping the wood. John and James, their robes soaked and clinging to their skin, exchanged a glance, their faces pale. Even Thomas, who had been muttering prayers moments ago, stood silent, his skepticism drowned by the miracle before them. "Who is this man?" Andrew whispered, his voice barely audible. The others heard him, and the question echoed in their minds. They had seen Jesus heal lepers, give sight to the blind, and speak with wisdom that confounded scholars. But this was different. This was power over nature itself, over the untamed chaos of the sea. The disciples were fishermen, tax collectors, and zealots, men of different backgrounds united by their decision to follow Jesus. Yet, in this moment, they realized how little they truly understood him. Peter, always the first to speak, broke the silence. "Teacher," he said, his voice rough with awe, "even the wind and the waves obey you." It wasn't a question but a statement, tinged with both wonder and fear. He had sailed these waters his whole life, knew their moods and dangers, yet he had never seen anything like this. The others nodded, their eyes fixed on Jesus, waiting for an explanation, a reassurance, something to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Jesus sat back down, his movements calm, as if he hadn't just commanded the elements. "Why were you afraid?" he asked again, his tone softer now, almost tender. "Have I not been with you all this time?" The disciples shifted uncomfortably, their fear replaced by a different kind of unease. They had called out to him in desperation, accusing him of not caring, yet he had been there all along, unshaken by the storm. His question wasn't just about the storm, it was about their trust in him. Matthew, still clutching his sodden scroll, spoke up hesitantly. "Lord, we thought we were going to die. The storm, it was too much." His voice trembled, not from fear now, but from the realization of how quickly their faith had faltered. Jesus looked at him, his eyes kind but piercing. "The storm was never greater than me," he said simply. The words settled over them, heavy with truth. They had seen his power, but they had also seen their own weakness. As the boat drifted toward the opposite shore, the disciples began to process what had happened. The fear that had gripped them was gone, replaced by a mixture of awe and shame. They had doubted, panicked, even questioned Jesus' care for them. Yet, in a single moment, he had turned chaos into peace, proving not only his power but his presence with them. The lesson was clear, their trust needed to be stronger than the storms they faced. The stars grew brighter overhead, and the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of fish and salt. The disciples resumed their tasks, but their movements were slower, more thoughtful. They stole glances at Jesus, who had settled back against the cushion, his eyes closed once more. The boat was steady now, the journey continuing as if the storm had never happened. But for the disciples, everything had changed. They were beginning to see that following Jesus meant trusting him, even when the world seemed to fall apart. The boat glided smoothly across the now calm Sea of Galilee, the water reflecting the starlight like a mirror. The disciples, still shaken by the storm and its sudden end, worked in near silence, their minds churning with questions. The creak of the oars and the soft ripple of water were the only sounds, a stark contrast to the chaos of moments ago. Jesus sat quietly in the stern, his presence both comforting and unsettling. The disciples couldn't shake the image of him standing, commanding the wind and waves, nor could they forget his piercing question about their faith. Peter, still at the rudder, kept his eyes on the horizon, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had faced storms before, many of them worse than this one in terms of sheer size, but none had shaken him like this. It wasn't just the storm's ferocity, it was the way Jesus had silenced it with a word. Peter had always prided himself on his strength, his ability to handle whatever the sea threw at him. But tonight, he had been helpless, and Jesus had been in control. The realization humbled him, stirring a mix of gratitude and unease. John, sitting near the bow, ran his fingers through his damp hair, his mind replaying the moment Jesus spoke to the storm. He had grown up on these waters, knew their unpredictability, yet he had never imagined they could be tamed so completely. He glanced at his brother James, who was coiling a rope with more focus than necessary. "What kind of man is this?" John whispered, echoing Andrew's earlier question. James didn't answer, but his tight jaw suggested he was wrestling with the same thought. Thomas, ever the doubter, sat apart, staring into the water. He had called out to Jesus in desperation, half expecting no response. Now, with the sea calm and the boat steady, he felt exposed. His fear had revealed a lack of trust, not just in Jesus' power but in his care. Thomas had followed Jesus because of his teachings, his miracles, his promise of a kingdom. But tonight, he realized that following meant trusting, even when logic screamed that all was lost. Jesus, sensing the weight of their thoughts, opened his eyes and looked at them. "You've seen what I can do," he said, his voice steady but warm. "But it's not just about the storm. It's about knowing I'm with you, always." The disciples listened, their hearts stirring. They had seen his power, but his words pointed to something deeper, a relationship built on trust, not just miracles. The storm had tested them, and they had faltered, but Jesus' presence was a promise that they were never alone. As they neared the opposite shore, the disciples began to talk among themselves, their voices low but earnest. They spoke of the storm, of Jesus' words, of the way the sea had obeyed him. Matthew, ever the recorder, wished he had a dry scroll to capture it all. "This is more than a teacher," he said quietly to Philip, who nodded in agreement. "He's more than a prophet, too." The others overheard, and the weight of that truth settled over them. They were following someone whose power extended beyond human understanding. The lesson of the storm was beginning to take root. The disciples had faced chaos and found peace, not because of their own strength, but because of Jesus. Their faith, though shaken, was being refined. They were learning that trust wasn't just for the calm moments but for the moments when everything seemed lost. Jesus had been with them in the storm, just as he was with them now in the stillness. That truth, more than the miracle itself, began to anchor their hearts. The boat bumped gently against the shore, the soft scrape of wood on sand marking the end of their journey across the Sea of Galilee. The disciples disembarked, their legs unsteady not just from the boat's motion but from the weight of what they had witnessed. The night air was cool, the stars now bright in a clear sky, as if the storm had never been. They worked together to secure the boat, their movements automatic but their minds far from routine. Jesus stepped onto the shore, his presence steady, grounding them even as their thoughts swirled. Peter, tying the boat to a stake, couldn't shake the image of Jesus standing in the storm, his voice commanding the elements. He had always been a man of action, quick to take charge, but tonight he felt small, his confidence in his own abilities shaken. He glanced at Jesus, who was speaking quietly with Andrew, and wondered how he could ever doubt again. Yet, he knew the lesson wasn't just about the storm, it was about trusting Jesus in every moment, seen and unseen. John and James, unloading the oars, spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen. "He didn't just stop the storm," John said, his voice tinged with awe. "He spoke to it like it was alive, like it knew him." James nodded, his usual brashness subdued. "I've never seen anything like it. Not in all my years on the water." They looked toward Jesus, who was now helping Matthew gather his scattered belongings, and felt a mix of reverence and curiosity. Who was this man they followed? Thomas, lingering by the water's edge, stared out at the now calm sea. The fear that had gripped him during the storm was gone, but it had left behind a lingering question: could he trust Jesus completely? He had seen the miracle, felt the peace that followed, but his mind still wrestled with doubt. Jesus' question, "Do you still have no faith?" echoed in his heart. Thomas wanted to believe, but he knew it would take more than one miracle to fully surrender his need for certainty. Jesus gathered the disciples around him on the shore, the moonlight casting soft shadows. "Tonight, you saw the storm," he said, his voice carrying the same authority that had silenced the waves. "But storms will come again, on the sea, in your hearts, in the world. Trust in me, not in what you see." His words were simple but profound, a challenge to anchor their faith in him, not in their circumstances. The disciples nodded, some with conviction, others with hesitation, knowing this was a lesson they would need to learn again and again. As they prepared to move on, the disciples felt a shift within themselves. The storm had been a test, not just of their courage but of their faith. They had seen Jesus' power, but more importantly, they had seen his presence. He had been with them in the boat, unshaken by the chaos, and he would be with them in whatever lay ahead. The lesson of trust was not a one-time event but a journey, one they were only beginning to understand. The group set off from the shore, their footsteps crunching on the sand, their hearts full of questions and newfound resolve. The Sea of Galilee lay still behind them, a silent witness to the miracle that had changed them. They followed Jesus into the darkness, not knowing what lay ahead but beginning to trust that, with him, they could face anything. The storm had taught them that faith was not the absence of fear but the courage to trust in the one who was greater than the storm.